part of the reason that we did that originally, switched around Buddhism and Hinduism, is because Buddhism actually came out of Hinduism. And so it helps us to understand Buddhism to discuss Hinduism first. That's why we did Hinduism last time. And there's a lot of Buddhist doctrine and Buddhist belief that we already know now that we've covered Hinduism. And we'll talk a little about the ones they have in common here in a minute. Now, to a large degree, Buddhism is so old that it's like Hinduism in the sense that, remember last week we said it's kind of like nailing Jell-O to a wall? You get such a wide variety of beliefs. In this area they believe this type of Buddhism, in this area this one, and it's really, really hard to nail it down. But we're going to try to talk about the specifics tonight. So when you guys think of Buddhism, when someone says Buddhist, what picture comes to mind? What do you think of? Statue of Buddha, okay. Anybody else?
Big statue on a...
Sometimes they have massive statues, like that one, yeah. Anything else come to mind? Typically, you think of Buddhism. People in the West tend to think of Buddhism in a very favorable light. We sort of have a fascination and a mysticism kind of, all sort of thing at a lot of Eastern philosophy and Eastern religions. I insist that is at least partially because in the West we're actually pretty ignorant of what these religions are. But to understand them better is going to be a little bit different than our perception or how we typically think of it. I've heard missionaries to Buddhist countries actually tell me that when they preach Christ or when they disagree with Buddhism, they've actually the strongest opposition they've met when they say that is not from Buddhists living in the East, it's from people living in the West who have such a positive view of Buddhism, they don't want anyone saying anything bad about it. Because common perception is you think of this nice, happy, peaceful guy sitting under a tree with his legs crossed meditating, and there's a lot more to it than just that. With that said, I will tell you a short story before we jump into it. There was a guy in the area who was having some major issues in his life. He was drug addict and he was taken to the hospital. And I went to the hospital just to see him, just because I'm the preacher in the community. And I went to go see this guy and talk with him a little bit. And he began to talk with me about how interested and excited he was about Buddhism for some reason. He had found some Facebook group or something online and something about Buddhism. It was teaching him all these things about Buddhist philosophy, and he said, "Oh, you can be a Christian and a Buddhist, you could be a Hindu and a Buddhist, you could be a Muslim and you can be all these things, but it's just this great Buddhist philosophy, and I enjoy, all the great things that Buddhism has to offer." And that was kind of a situation where, in hindsight, I wish I had been a little more confident in what I knew about Buddhism, a little more assured that what I knew was accurate. I wish I had been a little more aggressive in talking to him. Because there are things I probably would have told him were I in that situation again. I didn't tell him that in Buddhism, the highest goal, your ultimate goal, is to basically stop existing. I didn't tell him that in Buddhism, the best way to live a meaningful life is to not care about anything, to completely detach from everything around you. I didn't tell him that there are some sects of Buddhism that believes the best honor you can do is offer to have your body devoured by demons. I didn't tell him that. But those are sides of the Buddhist faith that we don't always see. Now, with that said, that's not something that Buddhist people always know about and always are really strong, have a strong conviction of, especially not lay people. They don't always know all these things about Buddhism. They're not always really serious about the Buddhist faith. I mean, we have a Buddhist here in our church. She's a very nice lady, like her a lot. So there's a big separation between the Buddhist ministry and the lay people in it. All right. Only other thing before we jump into this is Buddhism, more than any other religious belief, has struggles with the concept of cognitive dissonance. Do you guys remember? We talked about was a common cult characteristic. Do you guys remember what cognitive dissonance means? Basically the ability to believe two contradictory things at the same time. Two things that completely contradict it, but you still believe it. Buddhism, you find that in Buddhism more than any other religious belief. But Eastern philosophy is a little more comfortable with that than Western philosophy. So, let's talk about some famous Buddhists. Do you guys know any famous Buddhists? There's a few you probably hear of before. No? It's a popular religion. You'd be surprised. Let's look at some famous Buddhists here. Of course, obviously, the Dalai Lama. We know that guy, right? Well, we'll learn a little bit more about him when we talk about Tibetan Buddhism. Tiger Woods. You knew Tiger Woods was Buddhist? Didn't know that? Yeah, it came out a few years ago that he had converted to Buddhism. Steven Seagal. This is especially interesting in light of the idea you think of Buddhism as so peaceful and so, and Steven Seagal, this action movie actor. Granted, he's just acting, but I didn't know he was a Buddhist till I looked it up. Tina Turner. I didn't know that about her either. Jet Li. You guys know who Jet Li is, right? He's basically like he's a kung fu movie actor. He does a lot of action kung fu movies. Really, really talented athlete, phenomenal. But he's a raised Buddhist. And Orlando Bloom. I didn't know he was a Buddhist. You know the actor Orlando Bloom, right? Yeah. Anyway, Orlando Bloom, Buddhist. So, let's talk just a little bit about the history of Buddhism, where it came from, how it got started. And it all started with a guy that people call Buddha, although that is not actually his name. Buddha is more of a title. It means like an enlightened or an awakened person. Well, we'll talk a little about the history of Buddhism. Started with a man named Siddhartha Gautama. Okay? Now, Gautama lived in northeast India, 6th century BC, so about 500 years or so, a little more than 500 years before 500 or 600 years before Jesus. Right? And it was in India. And we know that, he lived in India. Remember, Buddhism came out of Hinduism. Okay? So you had Hinduism, and Gotama ended up kind of creating Buddhism and breaking it off away from Hinduism. Now, when we talked about Hinduism, we talked about this big movement that came through right at about this time that they called the Way of Knowledge. Prior to this, Hinduism had been big on, its priests, and you go to this temple and you do all these exact rituals and these exact observances, and they broke away from that and they sort of became this more mystic kind of thing. Hinduism became something where people just kind of sat around and meditated all the time, or they would practice this extreme asceticism. They'd go days without eating, and that was supposed to be a path to enlightenment in Hinduism. Well, that's about the time that Gotama was around. And so Gotama actually picked up on some of that. It makes perfect sense. It was right along with the Way of Knowledge that he came around. And there's not really a lot of information on him. We know that he lived in northeastern India, 6th century, right around the time of the Way of Knowledge. And it seems very likely that he was probably a prince, a ruler of some kind. But that's necessary in the legend of Gotama too. So, according to legend, he was a prince, which he may actually have been. But before he was born, there was supposed to be this prophecy told his mother about him, in which he would either become a great king or a great religious leader. He was going to be one of those. If he stayed inside the palace walls his whole life and never was exposed to anything bad, he would be a great king. But if he went outside and he began to see suffering and pain, he'd be this great religious leader. So the legend goes that his father tried to protect him by keeping him locked up in the castle where he'd never see anything, any pain, sickness, death, any sort of religious practice, anything like that. So he was locked up where he wouldn't see these things because his father wanted him to be a great ruler. The story goes that one day he convinced his father to let him ride through the country, and so his father allowed him to, but first off there were 4 things. It was sickness, old age, death, and religious asceticism. Right? Monks who practice, basically making themselves miserable. Anyway, his father got rid of all that, so got it all out of sight, away from the road, so his son could ride through and not see it. But he rode through and saw them anyway. Legend says it was actually these gods that came down and pretended to be all these things to expose him to it. But once he did this, he decided that he would pursue a life of renunciation. He'd give up all the pleasures, everything great in life that he had, to try and find out the real meaning and the real purpose, to try to find enlightenment. Now, this is a big problem with Buddhism, but it kind of goes along to some degree with Buddhist philosophy. Is at the time he was like 29 years old, something like this, when he left his palace and when he did that. But at the time, he had a wife and he had a young child, a young son. And he actually ended up abandoning his family. He left everything about his old life behind, including his family. He abandoned them to go and try and find the secret of enlightenment. Now, to Buddhists, they don't see that as such a bad thing, but I don't know, that really bothers me about the guy. But he spent 7 years practicing asceticism, just making himself miserable, coming on the brink of starvation to try and achieve enlightenment. It didn't work. Finally, he decided he would sit under a tree and meditate until he became enlightened. He sat under the tree and meditated. The next day, he came up and said, "Oh, I'm enlightened now," which is kind of sketchy in and of itself, because how do we know he's enlightened? He just sat down for a few hours and then got up and said, "Oh, I understand the world now." So he claimed to have achieved enlightenment, and he produced a particularly unusual philosophy of the world from that. So, any questions so far? Okay. All right. Buddhist teaching. So Buddhism has a number of similarities to Hinduism, including they have a vague belief in polytheism. They sort of have this idea that there's lots of gods out there, although in Buddhism it doesn't really hash out the same as it does in other religions. Buddhists do believe in karma. Anybody remember what karma is? We talked about it with Hinduism. Yeah, it's like this impersonal force that balances good and evil. If I did something bad to somebody, then karma is going to come back and get me later, and I'm going to have to suffer for it. Or if I do something good, I'm going to receive good in the future. That's basically what karma is. And karma is going to affect your reincarnation. Anybody know what reincarnation is? Yeah, when you die, you're reborn as something else later on. So if I'm a really, really bad person in this life, or even in past lives, and I die, well then karma's going to make sure I come back as like a fruit fly or a worm or something, rather than like a really rich guy. So, by the way, bonus points. Does anybody remember what we said the big problems with karma and reincarnation are? Either one? A lot of times there's not motivation to get out of a bad situation. If a person is living a miserable life, abusive family, whatever's going on, if they believe in karma or reincarnation, they may think, well, I deserve this because I did something bad in the last life, so I don't want to get out of this suffering. I need to pay for what I did so I can have a good life later. It keeps people from really advancing and progressing in ways that they otherwise could. Also, sometimes it keeps people from helping others. If I see somebody who's miserable, it's easy for me to think, well, he deserves it. He's suffering. I don't want to mess up his karma. I don't want to get in the way of karma. I just let him suffer so he can be better in his next life. So problems can come about from that. That's how it's similar to Hinduism. Let's talk about how it's different. And it seems to me there's three main areas where Hinduism and Buddhism are different. Okay? First is the path to enlightenment. Again, there's a number of philosophies in Hinduism for enlightenment. Buddha came up with his own specific philosophy. We'll talk about in a second. They rejected the caste system, of course, and also the concept of Maya. Anybody remember what Maya is from the Hindu lecture? It's getting more into the really specifics of it. Basically, Maya is the concept of things that don't exist. They believe everything is either Brahman or Maya. And Brahman is like this, personal, or not, it's like this impersonal just existence, this being. And everything is either Brahman or it's Maya. It's real or it's not. It's actually exists or it's just an illusion. So he has a very different concept of Maya that defines Hinduism or Buddhism. Okay. Let's talk about Buddha's teaching as far as how to achieve enlightenment. Buddha taught that a person can achieve enlightenment through 4 noble truths and an 8-fold path. Okay? The 4 noble truths, see how compatible these are with Christianity. Think about this in your mind, okay? To live is to suffer. That's truth number 1. Suffering is caused by desire. In other words, if I want something, that's what causes me to suffer. If I'm in pain, the reason I'm suffering is not because I'm in pain. The reason I'm suffering is because I desire to not be in pain. If I didn't desire that, I wouldn't be suffering. One can eliminate suffering by eliminating desire. In other words, detach, stop caring about things, and you're not going to suffer anymore. And desire is eliminated through the Eightfold Path. I don't know, I see some pretty big differences with Christianity in that. Buddhists who really take this philosophy seriously can sometimes come to a conclusion that they shouldn't care about anything. Like Gotama, who left his family, he was more concerned with enlightenment than he was with actually being a husband and a father. And again, you don't find this among every Buddhist, but Buddhists who really are deep into the philosophy, you find almost a desire to just detach and not care about anything. If people are suffering, the problem with suffering is I'm attached to these people, I'm attached to them, and I don't want them to suffer, so I suffer. Best way to eliminate my suffering is to stop caring about them. To some extent. Now, different schools of Buddhism will handle that differently, but seems to me to be a logical conclusion of it. Anyway, Eightfold Path just deals with how you perceive life, the right view, right intention, right speech, which is like saying the right things and not saying things you shouldn't, doing just enough and not doing more than you should for action, things like that. All right. Let's talk about Buddhist teaching on the caste system. Pretty simple. Buddha rejected the caste system. Everybody remember what the caste system is in Hinduism? Yep. Yep, the hierarchy in society, basically. It's been used as sort of a controlling method to keep people where they are. You know, you keep these poor people down here. They're in the caste system. They got there by karma and reincarnation. So you keep them in the low caste. Us up here in the high caste, we're doing good. We don't waste our time with them. So anyway, Buddhism rejected the caste system, which is pretty much the biggest reason, it seems, that Hindus do not consider Buddhists to be Hindu. They have a lot of similar beliefs, but if you ask a Hindu if Buddhists are Hindu, they'll say no, they're heretical because they reject the caste system. That's very essential in Hinduism, and Buddha did away with it. He didn't want it. Okay. And the biggest difference, as far as I'm concerned, between Hinduism and Buddhism is Buddha's teaching of Maya. Remember, we said Hinduism teaches everything either is or isn't. It's Brahman or it's Maya. And Maya is just this illusion that's not actually real. So Hinduism teaches there's things in the world that are not real. We just have to learn to get past that. Here's the thing that Gotama did different. After he sat under this tree meditating for a whole day and got up the next day and said he had reached an enlightenment, this was really sort of the core of his message, was that actually everything is Maya. What he taught is that literally nothing exists. You don't exist. The chair you're sitting in does not exist. The earth you're standing on and the universe and everything, none of this actually exists, according to actual strict Buddhist philosophy. Which is somewhat odd. Can anybody see maybe a little bit of cognitive dissonance in that? How does that not make sense? How can that not make sense, though? I phrased that wrong. Does anybody see a contradiction inherent in that? Well, here's the big thing. All right, let's take it from Robin's perspective. He said, it sounds like you're hallucinating. You see all these things around you. Here's the question. Who's hallucinating? There's no one to hallucinate. And yet, we're seeing, do you see, it's, you have all this world and it's not really there, and you see it and it's fooling you, but you're not actually there to be fooled. And so, anyway, that's how Buddhism, people who understand Buddhism say at its core, it really is atheistic. Because according to Buddhism, nothing exists, including gods. Now, well, we'll talk about that in just a second, about what they think about gods, but, it's sort of a strange mentality. You have to understand this to get to enlightenment. Understand that nothing exists, even though there's no way you can understand it, because if you understand it, it implies you exist, but you don't exist, so you can't actually understand it. That's sort of the cognitive dissonance you find in Buddhism. Okay. Any questions?
In other words, how can he be enlightened if he doesn't exist?
Exactly. Yep. And I actually read, I think it was a lecture that had been typed down as a transcript by a Buddhist scholar to a college class. I was reading some of this lecture and trying to understand how they explain that. I was searching for something else and came across this. And they have this strange explanation, but the explanation still doesn't really work very well. It's the idea that things sort of exist, but they don't actually exist. They both exist and don't exist at the same time, which again, that's cognitive dissonance.
It makes you wonder what happens if you take away the non-existent chair that you're sitting on when they take it away, and see what happens to your non-existent body.
Yeah, well, your non-existent body would fall on the non-existent floor, I imagine. So, all right. Any other questions or anything? All right. Let's talk about essential Christian doctrine in Buddhism. The doctrine of man, of course, as Christians, we believe that man's a creation of God. And we believe that we are lost in sin, we need Christ. Buddhists believe that our ultimate goal is not to be out of our sin, but our ultimate goal is to achieve enlightenment and eventually escape existence. By the way, I didn't explain this very well, but, the Hindu concept of, well, we'll talk about that when we get to salvation, but basically you want to get out of existence because you don't exist anyway. The Buddhist concept of God. Now, as Christians, of course, we believe one God, Trinitarian in nature. We believe He created the whole universe. Now, Buddhism usually has a polytheistic tint to it. It came out of Hinduism, which has some polytheistic tendencies to it. So Buddhists will acknowledge different gods. In fact, in the Buddhist countries closest to India, you'll sometimes see Hindu gods decorating their temples, right? Up on statues of the gods up on their temples. But some Buddhists believe in gods, but ultimately Buddhist teaching is that God is just a compilation of karma. Basically, all this excess karma floating around out there somewhere compiles together and it creates, or it is, that compiled karma is a God. Now, think about this. In Buddhism, you don't exist, right? So what does that say about the good things you do? Yeah, you're not actually doing them. They don't exist. So if the good things you do don't actually exist, what does that say about your karma? Your karma doesn't actually exist. And if the gods are compilations of karma, what does that say about the gods? It says that they don't exist. So that's how people say, well, Buddhism at its real root is atheistic. Now, not all Buddhists understand that. They don't all claim that. But that's just, like I said, our resident Buddhist here, she believes in God. I don't know if she believes in many gods or one God, but she believes in God. That's not something that always transfers from the priest or from the clergy down to the laity. But that's actually the Buddhist philosophy there. Okay. Now, as far as beliefs on Jesus, I didn't even put a slide up here for beliefs on Jesus because Buddhism doesn't really have any definite, consistent teaching on Jesus. Honestly, if you went to a lot of Asian countries, not all, but I mean a lot of them, especially ones that are that have been more isolated in the past, like Japan, maybe some areas of China, and you went up to a Buddhist person there and said, so what do you think about Jesus and Christianity? They'd say, who are you talking about? They really know very, very little. They may have some vague concept of something in American religion or something, but they don't know a whole lot about it. Okay. Death and resurrection. Of course, as Christians, we believe that Jesus died and was raised bodily. Buddhists support reincarnation rather than resurrection. They don't see any concept of why a person would need to rise from death when you're just going to be reincarnated. And finally, salvation. And this is the one that it's kind of hard to see why they believe it, or why. Anyway, I'll explain here. As Christians, we believe salvation is when we get to go and spend eternity with God. We get that salvation through Christ, and it's through grace, by faith, not because we do anything to earn it. Okay? For Buddhism, the concept of salvation is somewhat like the Hindu concept of nirvana. You guys remember that? Once you've done enough good and have reached enlightenment and done all these great things, you just escape the cycle of reincarnation. Your existence just kind of melds into the existence of the Brahman or everything up in there. That's Hinduism. Buddhism, because they don't actually believe in anything, salvation to a Buddhist is basically once you've reached enlightenment, when you die, instead of being reincarnated, that's it. You're gone. You cease to exist. That's their concept of salvation. And That's not a very comforting thing to me, is to cease to exist. But keep in mind, one of the core principles is all life is suffering. If you're alive, you're suffering. So they want to end suffering by simply ceasing to exist. And they, of course, believe you get to that state of enlightenment by self-realization, you have to do it by yourself, but you realize that nothing really exists and go through all this enlightenment thing in the Eightfold Path. And that's how you get salvation. Okay. Questions so far? I will try to answer.
A couple.
Okay.
I saw Buddhists in Southeast Asia.
Uh-huh.
I had no clue what they were doing most of the time. But I've been through some of the temples or around. I never saw them out there.
Really? Yeah.
Do they have service?
I think they do. Yeah. It's not necessarily like a Christian concept where necessarily it's this once big meeting once a week where everybody gets together and does all that. They do have certain and again, it'll depend from Buddhist group to Buddhist group. It'll be different in Japan than in Southeast Asia and different in Tibet, but they do have, I guess, like ceremonies that they go through. Some group.
Monasteries.
Yeah. But they do have temples. I mean, if you went to one and it was empty, it may be because they just weren't doing anything at the...
I was in really bad places where they had to.
Right. And
like Bangkok,
mm-hmm.
there's a huge Buddhist temple there. That's where the golden Buddha is.
Uh-huh.
Reclining Buddha or whatever it is. And it was a tourist attraction. It wasn't really
There weren't actually Buddhist people there. It was all Americans, right?
I never saw any kind of, service.
Yeah. And I'm not really sure why that would be. Unless there's just not that many people who are really attending a service or that serious about it there. I don't know.
To me, if you don't exist, how do you become a Buddhist?
Well,
are you born a Buddhist? Or, if I wanted to become a Buddhist, how do you do that?
Well, Alan, don't take this personally, but for that reason, that kind of questioning, you probably wouldn't make a very good Buddhist because of that, okay? To a large degree...
You see the little monks in some pretty bad places just wandering around and, with head shaved and carrying cups and begging and stuff like that.
Yeah.
But I never ever saw any of them doing anything.
Well, you said, and that was in Southeast Asia. You saw them walk around begging. That's because they are probably Theravada Buddhism, and that's a certain sect of Buddhism that we'll actually talk about here in a second. And
Southeast Asia, mostly Burma.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Burma, that's
Burma,
Thailand, Laos, Burma. Yep. That's very much. That's a lot of Theravada Buddhism. Yep. Okay.
That's because they didn't exist.
I'm saying, all this stuff is supposed to be. I don't think higher woods makes it very good.
No. Any other questions? Okay. So let's talk about different branches of Buddhism. And actually, next slide is Theravada Buddhism. Now, there are two main philosophies of Buddhism. There's what's called Theravada Buddhism, and there's what's called Mahayana Buddhism. Now, roughly, they've been given the nicknames, and I think Mahayana actually made me little raft and big raft. Okay? Like a raft you put in the water. Because the idea is how many people you can fit on it. Little raft is Theravada Buddhism. That means only a few people. It's a small raft, so only a few people can actually get to enlightenment. Not everybody can. Mahayana Buddhism is a little more open. It says, no, really anybody can achieve enlightenment and can become a Buddha if they're going to follow the right path and do the right things. But Theravada Buddhism is sort of a big chunk in and of itself. Like we said, it's Thailand, Burma, Cambodia, Laos. It's Southeastern Asia. It's areas very close to India. And truth be told, if I had to guess, if I had to give my estimate of it, this is probably the closest thing to what Gotama actually taught. Of all the different brands of Buddhism and types and philosophies, I think this is closest to original Buddhism, if you can say such a thing as original Buddhism. But basically, you have to be a monk to reach enlightenment and to enter nirvana. If you're not a monk, sorry. By the way, ladies, you can't be monks. Sorry. Wait for your next life. Be good enough, maybe you'll get there. Theravada Buddhism, basically, monks devote themselves entirely. They live in this temple. They have this long list of rules. There are some prohibitions we'll talk about in a minute for your average Buddhist, but they have more rules for the monks. Spend a lot of time begging. They spend a lot of time meditating, things like that. And their goal is to reach enlightenment. Now, everybody who's not a monk, they come in, their job is to help the monks, is to basically support them financially. Because monks aren't actually, making a lot of money or anything. The temples aren't making a lot of money except by what people buy from them or give to them or donate to them. And so basically the hope is if I can't be a monk for whatever reason, if I don't feel that I'm ready, or if you're a woman, you don't think you can't be a monk if you're a woman, your hope is you give enough to the temple, you donate enough, you be faithful enough to your local temple. That's going to build up some good karma, and the next life, maybe you'll be reincarnated as someone who can be a monk. And then you can hopefully go on to enlightenment. So, this is actually, and I've heard missionaries talk about this. Missionary lady I heard actually speak at ICOM this year said that this is a big problem in that a lot of families will send their young children, or their young sons, to go be monks. And so, whereas normally a young son might grow up and get a job and help support the family and help take care of them, rather what happens is he leaves and the whole family is left just trying to support him and the other monks at the temple. And it actually hurts a lot of families because of the method you have to go through to reach enlightenment. So she insisted it was actually a pretty devastating thing on the family. Even though the family wanted that, they supported it, it was still difficult on them.
So this isn't like Mormons who go on their 2-year, whatever they call it,
yeah.
missions
Yeah.
thing. Once, and this is what I thought, watching that, you see a lot of just young boys with their head shaved wandering around with their cups.
Mm-hmm.
And they call it, I thought it was like a 2-year thing, and then they went back to their family and went to work.
You're partially right. Actually, in a lot of these Theravada areas, all young boys, it's like a rite of passage, almost like a natural part of your life. They'll spend several months or maybe even a year or so living in a temple, sort of building up good karma, living as a Buddhist, and then they go back. Now or living as a monk, and then they go back. Now there are some monks that stay and they decide to stay and live their whole lives. Those are the ones who got the best shot at reaching nirvana, basically stop existing. But yeah, there is sort of a rite where they'll spend a limited amount of time before they go back home. Yeah.
They have quite a bit of power too. Really.
Yeah.
I watch people during the monsoon when they put the boards across the street for you to cross.
Mm-hmm.
Just because it's pure mud.
Mm-hmm.
Here comes one of the little monks, and everybody would just jump off the board into the mud, and they'd go walking on across.
Yep. That is because you take care of the monks, and that builds up your karma and helps you later on in your next life. Yep. That's exactly it. All right. Any other questions on Theravada Buddhism? Now,
that explains a lot there.
Okay, good. Like I said, this is the small raft. This is the one where only a few people are gonna get into, nirvana, are gonna make it. Everyone else just has to wait for a future incarnation. Then you have a whole bunch of sects under a group called Mahayana, which means large raft. Large raft basically teaches that, individual people can make it. Just your lay people have a shot at nirvana if they do things right. There's one particular time, or several we'll talk about. One is called Pureland. It's the Pureland school of thought. So in this school, an adherent attempts to achieve enlightenment through a few things, but there's a big emphasis on chanting. And I'm not sure where that came from. That was actually very popular in some Hindu groups. You ever heard anyone chant? I heard it when we went to Washington, D.C. for vacation a few years back. I heard there was a guy out there chanting Hare Krishna over and over and over again. You ever hear anyone chant that in some place? Anyway, so, yeah, and in a lot of Western philosophies, Hinduism and Buddhism, the emphasis is you chant something over and over and over again, and somehow that helps you move closer to enlightenment if you chant it so many times a day. So they just chant the same thing over and over and over again, hundreds or even thousands of times a day. But Pureland teaches that there was a Buddha a long time ago, and I don't think he was an actual historical figure. I believe he was entirely legendary. Don't quote me on that, though. A guy named Amida. And after he became a Buddha and, ascended, after he became a Buddha, he created with the simple mental powers and mental faculties, he created a land in heaven, in the western part of heaven, called the Western Paradise. And that's a place where anyone who is devoted to him can go there when they die, instead of going back and being reincarnated. And once they're there, they have a chance of, basically, they can go there to attain enlightenment so that they don't have to go through another life and try to get it in this life. And that's actually really common. This is the most common form that you find in Japan. It's pretty common in Japan. A lot of it is in Japan. And this is the most common type of Buddhism in Japan. Okay. There's another popular type called Zen, very much in China. Zen Buddhism, it emphasizes you have to come to enlightenment through this realization, and you do it apart from words and apart from explanation. So no one sits down and says, okay, so you want to be enlightened, let's do this and this and this. You kind of have to come to it on your own. I read someone described it really well. They said Zen Buddhism is like a joke, in the sense that if someone tells a joke, you have to get it. And if they explain it to you, it's not a joke. It doesn't work anymore. It doesn't make sense. You have to come to it on your own. And so you see in Zen Buddhism a lot of emphasis on meditation. People just sit around and meditate, hoping they're going to achieve enlightenment in the process. I think one of the guys who was, I don't know if he founded or was influential in it, but he was just sitting and meditating. He meditated in front of a blank wall for like 3 years, and somebody walked by and smacked him in the head. And at the moment he got smacked in the head, he achieved enlightenment just like that. And he's like, aha! I don't know. That's the story behind. That's a popular story behind Zen Buddhism. Whatever. Like I said, very prominent in China. It's up to the individual to discover it. And one more popular branch of Buddhism we'll talk about is Tibetan Buddhism. Now, of course, that's the type that claims the Dalai Lama. And we all know him, right? He's almost more of a celebrity figure than he is like some distant monk sitting out, meditating somewhere, although he does do that a lot, I'm sure. So this is the one that is this is the really frightening school of Buddhism. When I was at ICOM, I met a missionary lady there, was talking about Buddhism. She had been raised as a missionary kid in Japan and had been to multiple countries all over the East, and dealt with multiple types of Buddhist people. And at one point she said, she said she wanted to understand. She wanted to learn and find out, in terms of just religion, what was the darkest, you might say most just horrible, like demonic religion in the world. And she said after all of her, studying different religions and things, the conclusion she came to was Tibetan Buddhism. This is a very intense one. It's very focused on animism, on appeasing evil spirits and things like that. It emphasizes a lot of magic practices. The lay people learn magic and magic rituals that are supposed to protect them from evil spirits, so they try to practice magic. There's a big emphasis on sex in this, on something like sex magic in Tibetan Buddhism. They believe that you master your passions by exercising them. So they believe basically all these things you're not supposed to do, just break the rules and do it and indulge in it. There's a lot of now not all Tibetan Buddhists do that, but there's a lot of really scary stuff. This is the type that believes, there are some Tibetan Buddhists that believe that you can attain enlightenment and become a Buddha basically in one night, but you have to spend the night in a cemetery calling out to demons to come and devour your body. And that's just sort of this ultimate act of compassion that's supposed to lead a person into enlightenment. And they say people try that, and the next morning they find them and they're insane. They've lost their mind after that. It's really scary stuff in this type of Buddhism, and yet that's what the Dalai Lama is a part of. And everybody thinks of him as this nice, happy, peaceful guy meditating under a tree. Well, you don't know what his sect of Buddhism actually believes. And they do believe, as the fifth Dalai Lama was the one who came to this conclusion, but they believe that the Dalai Lama is the incarnation of the God of compassion. He was on some sort of, it was an American, daytime talk show, something like that recently. Some big name lady who runs a talk, it wasn't like Oprah, but somebody like that, who interviewed him. Maybe it was just a news program. And at one point, they asked him, now keep in mind, they believe that he is the incarnation of the God of compassion. They asked him, now are you a God? And he told them no. Even though any Tibetan Buddhist will tell you, no, he's the 14th incarnation, because he's the 14th Dalai Lama, the 14th incarnation of the God of compassion. How do you think you can get away by saying no?
You must know something about Christianity.
Well, or maybe you know something about Buddhism. Yeah. In Buddhism, gods don't exist. So even though he's a god, he's not actually a god because he doesn't exist in the first place. Yeah. That's Tibetan Buddhism. That's kind of the frightening one. So, any questions or comments so far? Okay. Just a couple of general beliefs about Buddhism here. First off, there are some general prohibitions. A lot of just lay people in Buddhism are supposed to follow these. Interesting thing is they actually don't. They're not very good at following these, typically speaking. But there's several normal prohibitions, and you'll find it different in different areas. You'll find this very strong in Theravada areas, so like Southeast Asia. Of course, there's no killing, no stealing, no sexual infidelity, no lying, no alcohol. Now, you go there, you'll see people still drink alcohol. They don't follow these very well. But they are pretty serious about some of these things, especially the no killing. I heard a lady from a missionary, or it was the same missionary I listened to at ICOM. This is a true story. There was a missionary family that moved into an area, a Buddhist area, that was very, very strict on the no-killing law. This family was put on trial for murder. It was a missionary family was put on trial for murder. Do you know who they murdered? They hung up one of those fly traps in their home, and flies stuck to it and died. And they were put on trial for murder. Now, eventually they were let off the hook because the final conclusion was, well, the flies flew into it, so that was suicide, not actually murder. But some Buddhists are extremely, extremely serious about this. Some will not eat any meat at all because of that. So, interesting, huh? Questions, comments? Real quick, I just covered the Buddhist scriptures, what they believe is their scripture, what they treat as scripture anyway. The earliest is called the Tripitaka, which means 3 baskets. Those are the 3 baskets. It's 3 basically sets of teachings. It's filled with things they believe were original teachings of Buddha. There's no way of knowing that for sure because this wasn't written until over 100 years after Buddha died. But teachings of Buddha, philosophical concepts, things like that. They added a lot of other things, Lotus Sutra, Platform Sutra, all these others, Book of the Dead. Those are things that were added on later, and not all groups follow all of those. So some of them follow some of them don't. Like I said, nailing Jello to a wall, but those 3 are the original, closest ones originals. Okay. Questions or comments so far? We're nearing the end here. Okay. Let's talk about how to reach Buddhists. How to reach Buddhists. Now, there's a lot. Buddhism, as far as the things they believe in Christianity, they're about as opposite as you can get, it seems like. But actually, that gives us a lot of opportunity to really present the gospel in positive lights and in ways that Buddhists are not familiar with. If you ever meet a Buddhist. Now, obviously know that Buddhism is diverse. Like we said, you can't just say, oh, you're a Buddhist, so you must believe this, and this. It's hard to nail it down to that. But also know a lot of Buddhists, especially lay people, don't really know a lot about the Four Noble Truths. They don't know about different types of Buddhism. You walk up to a Buddhist and say, so are you a Theravada Buddhist or a Tibetan Buddhist? They'll say, what are you talking about? I'm just a Buddhist. Those sort of, we can classify and look at it, but they're not super aware of things like that. Not all Buddhists are necessarily concerned with reaching nirvana. They're not all necessarily trying to reach enlightenment. They're just living life and going through, because to a large degree, like a lot of other religions, Buddhism is cultural. They were raised and told you're a Buddhist. They said you do this because this is what Buddhists do. And that's pretty much all they do and all they know and all they follow about it. So there's a lot of nominalism in Buddhism, but it's a cultural identity, so it's hard for somebody to leave it. Okay. Here's a big thing. Emphasize the concrete nature of the Christian faith. That's one of the amazing advantages of Christianity. Our faith is built on actual, solid, historical truth. Buddhism, you don't actually need Buddha. You don't need Siddhartha Gautama to have Buddhism. All right? Buddhism is just a philosophy, and it's a very abstract and unusual philosophy at that. It's just a general, vague belief in something. Christianity is more concrete. It's rooted in the actual existence of an actual person in actual history. That gives us a big advantage on that, and that makes Christianity a little harder or a little easier to grasp. Now, to some degree, you may find that some Buddhists actually don't like that. They think, well, how can your religion be rooted in history? Your religion has to be rooted in lofty metaphysical concepts. So for some Buddhists, that can be a sort of a stumbling block, though. Number 4, share your understanding of heaven. Because after all, what's the Buddhist understanding of heaven? You stop existing. You finally get to the point you realize you're not even there. Bam. Until you reach enlightenment. Depends on who you are. Yep. So emphasize, share your understanding of heaven as this wonderful thing. You don't want to stop existing. You want to get to this perfect final end result that's going to last forever. All right. Emphasize salvation by grace. Buddhism, more than a lot of other religions, is all about what you do, your works. You follow the right prohibitions. You follow the Eightfold Path. You spend this much time meditating. You chant this many times. It's all about you. That's the assurance of Christianity. That's the great thing about it, is it has nothing to do with what I can do. It has to do with what Christ did. And there's a lot of peace in that. You don't have to go back to karma. Oh no, did I do something bad in my last life that's going to prevent me from making it all the way in this life? You don't worry about that. Number 6, show that life is a blessing. Show that there are great things in life, that it's a blessing from God and it can be enjoyed. Why would you think you'd want to emphasize that to a Buddhist? I remember number 1 of the Eightfold Path, or the four Noble Truths. Life is suffering. If you exist, you suffer. That's their belief. The Bible teaches something different. Yeah, there's a fallen world. This is a fallen world. Yeah, there's suffering. But at the same time, there's a blessedness in being a creation of God and being made in the image of God. And number 7, emphasize the ability of Jesus to take away sin. Okay? I don't have to, because in Buddhism, if you do something wrong, what's the solution? How are you forgiven for doing something wrong? Exactly. There's not a method. You go on to your next life and you suffer for it. And that's the only way to handle that. In Christianity, we have a means of forgiveness. Every human you meet naturally is going to have a sense of sin. They're going to understand that they're imperfect. We all understand that inherently. And there's got to be some way to take that away, some way to fix that. Okay, and Christianity's way is much, much preferable. Okay, just more info if you want it. You'll find it in your notes there. Sources you can look up. Anything? Any questions? Any comments? Anything?